In this extended fictional narrative, the character known as Ibrahim Traore, portrayed as the president of Burkina Faso, steps forward with an intensity in his voice that reflects not just the weight of his own heart, but the collective fire building within millions across the African continent, as he declares that the time for silence has expired, and the period of bending, bowing, and accepting disrespect is permanently over. He begins by saying that for far too long, Africa has been talked down to, manipulated, intimidated, and treated like a zone where powerful nations run experiments, shift political pieces, and decide destinies without consulting the very people who inhabit the land, a behavior that has persisted for generations, from colonial days to modern geopolitics. And so when a message circulated online, claimed to come from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, warning African leaders to stay in line, it didn't matter whether the statement was authentic or fake, because the tone behind it resembled the same arrogance Africa has endured for centuries, so he knew he had to speak. He recalls that moment in the fictionalized capital, Ouagadougou, where reporters, cameras, and citizens gathered with tension hanging thick in the air, everyone waiting to hear how he would respond. And he emphasizes that he arrived without a script, without rehearsed lines, because real truth never needs pages. It flows directly from the soul of someone who refuses to bow. He looked into the camera with unwavering eyes and delivered a message directed not just to Netanyahu, but to every global power that still behaves as if Africa is weak or directionless, affirming that Africa is no one's colony and that Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and every other African nation are sovereign lands whose dignity demands respect, saying that if anyone believes they can threaten, manipulate, or coerce the continent into submission, then they are profoundly mistaken. He describes how after speaking those words, the press room fell into a deep silence, the kind that only appears when truth has been spoken so boldly that no one dares to breathe too loudly. And he continued by leaning forward and clarifying that Burkina Faso does not answer to Tel Aviv, Washington, Paris, London, or any other global capital that has historically attempted to dictate African choices. Instead, it answers only to its own people, to its own soil, and to its own future, which has been neglected, exploited, and harmed by outsiders for decades, if not centuries. He emphasizes that this fictional statement was not aimed specifically at Israel, nor was it about a single country, but rather it was a symbolic rejection of every force throughout history that has tried to take advantage of Africa's divisions, resources, and political vulnerabilities. And so he insisted that the time had come for Africa to speak with one voice, to stand with unified purpose, and to resist any external pressure meant to weaken the continent's independence. He then explains how quickly the fictional speech spread across social media platforms, X, Telegram, WhatsApp, community networks, igniting discussions and hope among millions, reaching young people in Mali who had been yearning for a leader who speaks boldly, reaching farmers in Niger who have felt ignored by foreign-backed policies, reaching students in Guinea who demand dignity, and reaching activists in South Africa who fight daily against economic inequality. Within hours, the message evolved into a continental wave of solidarity, amplified by fictionalized leaders like Colonel Assimi Goïta in Mali and Madi Doumbouya in Guinea, who reposted the video and voiced their fictional support. And soon hashtags such as "Africa will not bow" and "We stand for West Africa" began trending across the Sahel, functioning not as mere slogans, but as battle cries representing unity, strength, and awakening. He then expands on the meaning of sovereignty, explaining that sovereignty is not just a political term found in textbooks or constitutions, but a living right, a nation's right to choose its partners, control its borders, protect its land, determine its policies, and decide how its resources are extracted, shared, and valued. Foreign governments have repeatedly treated Africa like a chessboard on which they move soldiers, companies, aid, pressure tactics, sanctions, or incentives, thinking African nations should simply nod and comply. But those days are ending, and the new era demands Africa reclaim full agency.
He points out that this fictional commitment to sovereignty inspired the creation of the Sahel Alliance, which unites Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in a new political, economic, and security partnership built on mutual respect and brotherhood, encapsulated in the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all, sending a message that Africa's unity is growing stronger than ever. Continuing his fictional message, he recalls how critics accused him of being reckless, saying he was provoking global powers unnecessarily or jeopardizing diplomatic relations. But he argues that silence is the real danger, because silence invites exploitation, invites disrespect, and invites foreign dominance. He notes that after the fictional speech, Israel's government did not issue any statement, and many Western media outlets avoided reporting the story, which he interprets in this fictional narrative as evidence that powerful nations are unprepared for African leaders who are no longer willing to stay quiet or play the familiar game of politeness. He insists he never intended to become a symbol, but the overwhelming response from Africans across the continent, messages of pride, unity, courage, made him realize that the moment was bigger than him, and that he had become a fictional representation of a larger awakening that had been building in Africa for decades.
He dreams of a reimagined Africa, one where African children attend schools that teach African history, not colonial narratives, where hospitals are well-equipped, staffed, and accessible, where economies flourish because the continent's wealth stays within its borders, where foreign companies no longer extract gold, oil, diamonds, uranium, and other valuable minerals only to sell back finished goods at inflated prices, and where African unity extends from the Sahel to the Horn, from North Africa to Southern Africa, creating a continental identity that is unbreakable. He emphasizes that foreign nations must understand that their old tactics, coercion, threats, manipulation, bribery, military bases, or economic pressure will no longer work, because Africa is rising, remembering its rich history, its powerful ancestors, and its inherent worth. He turns his attention back to the fictional speech moment, describing how journalists stood silent, some shocked, some inspired, some unsure of how the world would react, but he felt relief in his heart because he knew he had finally spoken the truth without fear. He says that leaders who hesitate or whisper behind closed doors allow exploitation to continue, but leaders who speak boldly open the door to transformation, even if the message is uncomfortable for global powers. He insists that he did not speak for applause or attention, but for the dignity of his people, the future of Africa, and the memory of ancestors who endured suffering under colonial and post-colonial systems that benefited everyone except Africans themselves. Then he reminds his fictional audience that the most dangerous weapon foreign powers use is fear. Fear of sanctions, fear of retaliation, fear of isolation. But Africa can break this fear only by standing united, sharing resources, supporting each other, and building institutions capable of resisting foreign manipulation. He says that Burkina Faso is no longer interested in deals that enrich outsiders while impoverishing citizens, or in relationships where African nations serve as tools for foreign strategic battles. Instead, it wants partnerships based on equality, transparency, and respect, and it will reject any alliance that threatens the dignity of its people. Then, when he reinforces that the fictional moment is not the climax, but the beginning of a movement, an awakening, a long overdue shift in Africa's destiny, he calls on the youth to rise, the workers to stand firm, the students to demand change, the elders to guide the new generation, and the entire continent to embrace unity over division, courage over fear, and dignity over silence. He states that the fictional speech represents a promise that Africa will no longer kneel, will no longer whisper its grievances, will no longer allow foreign nations to define its worth, but will stand tall, proud, and unafraid, with the spirit too strong to be broken and a future too bright to be stolen. In this final extended portion of the fictional speech, the leader continues addressing the continent with a deeper intensity, almost as if every heartbeat amplifies his determination, stating
that the time for hesitation is over and the entire African continent must rise with clarity, purpose, and unity because no foreign power, no matter how wealthy, militarily advanced, or historically dominant, has the moral right to dictate the future of a land that does not belong to them. He emphasizes that Africa's soil has carried the memories of kingdoms older than many nations that now pretend to hold authority over it, and therefore the idea that outsiders can intimidate or silence Africans is not only insulting, but fundamentally absurd. He reminds everyone listening that the fictional speech he delivered earlier was not crafted to provoke war, nor to create hostility, but to awaken a sleeping giant, the collective strength of more than 1 billion people who have been conditioned to doubt themselves. And he urges the youth to look at the world map and notice how Africa, the second largest continent, has been systematically undervalued because its leaders were pressured to serve foreign interests rather than their own citizens. He describes how in private diplomatic rooms that ordinary people never see, representatives of powerful nations attempt to negotiate deals that would strip African countries of their minerals, their land, their industries, and their autonomy in exchange for financial crumbs, and he insists that the era of secret exploitation must be brought into the light. His voice becomes sharp as he says that foreigners are welcome to partner with Africa, but only under terms based on fairness, mutual respect, and shared prosperity, not the predatory arrangements of the past where outsiders took 90% of the profit and left the continent with 10% of the problems. He recalls fictional meetings where foreign envoys spoke with arrogance, assuming African leadership would bend instantly at the mention of sanctions or aid, but he asserts with unshakable confidence that Africa will not kneel before threats that are designed to maintain dependency.
He then turns his message toward the African people themselves, telling them that real freedom is not granted, it is built, defended, and protected. He warns that unity is the most powerful weapon Africa possesses, because the moment African nations stand together, economically, politically, culturally, the entire global balance changes, and those who profited from division begin to panic. He speaks of a future where African countries create joint energy grids, unified transportation networks, and regional industries that allow them to transform raw materials into finished products rather than exporting wealth and importing poverty. His speech grows almost poetic as he talks about seeing children in villages and cities, some walking miles just to reach school, some studying under dim candles, some dreaming of becoming engineers, doctors, and innovators, and he declares that their dreams will no longer be delayed simply because foreign governments consider Africa a marketplace instead of a home for human progress. He stresses that Africa's reclaiming of dignity does not require permission from any country, nor does it require approval from institutions that were built during colonial eras. Instead, it requires courage from every African man, woman, and child to believe that the continent's future can be rewritten with African hands. He addresses critics who say Africa is too divided, too unstable, or too dependent to rise, calling such opinions echoes of old colonial narratives designed to keep Africans uncertain of their own capabilities. He urges listeners to reject these narratives completely, stating that the strength of a continent is not measured by its past wounds, but by its willingness to heal and rebuild. He reflects on how the fictional video of his earlier speech spread across the continent, not because people wanted conflict, but because they were hungry to hear someone speak without fear, someone who refused to bow, someone who challenged the idea that African leaders must always be cautious, diplomatic, and silent while others speak boldly about Africa as if Africans were not in the room. He again clarifies that this speech is symbolic, representing the feelings of many who have been silent for too long, and that it stands for a new generation rising with sharp minds and unbreakable determination. As he moves toward his conclusion, his tone becomes steady and resolute, stating that Africa is not seeking isolation, but insisting on equal treatment, not demanding special privilege, but demanding fairness, not closing its doors, but refusing to allow those doors to be used as pathways for exploitation. He envisions an Africa where young entrepreneurs build companies that compete on the global stage, where universities become hubs of innovation, where local industries grow strong enough to eliminate dependence on imported goods, and where every African child feels proud of the place they call home. Finally, he ends the fictional speech with a powerful message that Africa will rise not because others will help it rise, but because Africans have chosen to stand, chosen to speak, and chosen to walk forward with unshakable conviction. He tells the people to remember that dignity is not given freely. It must be demanded, upheld, and protected every day. He raises his voice one last time and declares that as long as Africans remain united, no threat can silence them, no fear can weaken them, and no foreign hand can shape their destiny without their consent. And with those final words, he concludes by saying, the future belongs to a courageous Africa, an Africa that is awake, aware, determined, and unstoppable.